Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Emotional Embuffination podcast. I'm your host, David Ingleton, and here on Emotional Embuffination, we are training to become emotionally buff enough to overcome any conflict in life. And at the same time, we are trying to maximize and optimize positive feelings. In other words, we're trying to get you through the hard times and have you walking away feeling as good as possible as we go through this journey of life. This podcast is just one of a number of resources I have available. If you want to learn more, please go to the Embuffination website, the Emotional Embuffination website, which is embuff.com. That's embuff.com. While you are there, check out all the stuff that we've got. I've got books, a game, there's all sorts of things there, this podcast. There's also, make sure that you sign up for the newsletter. And then you'll be up to date on all the recent tips and tricks and news going on related to emotional embuffination. Also, it would super help me if wherever you are listening to this or viewing this, you make sure you like, subscribe, do all the stuff there. That would super help me out. Okay, on today's show, we are going to be talking about something that I think is incredibly important. This is a theme I've been running on for a long time, and I would argue that this is one of the most important tricks in minimizing anger and stopping anger from perpetuating. I have a whole chapter on this in my book, the Emotional Embuffination book, and it's something that is totally contrary to what we typically hear as sort of mental health advice in dealing with anger. And that is, stop venting. We don't want to vent. Now, I know that sounds totally contrary to probably what most of you have been told, because usually we have this model of a steam valve. We think of anger as a thing that's just building up, it's building up, it's building up, and then if it doesn't get released, we're going to explode, and it's just going to be messy. This model has been around forever. We've got to let that steam out or everything's going to get terrible. I remember when I was little, I used to watch these old Disney cartoons, and they had this visual of Donald Duck that would pop up over and over again. I remember seeing this all the time, where he would get super red because he was very angry, like his face would literally turn red, smoke would come out of his ears, and you would hear this steam valve whistle like coming, and then all of a sudden he would explode, he'd start yelling, and he'd just go totally crazy. So this is not a new model by any stretch of the imagination. I've heard this for my entire life, and obviously these Disney cartoons came out way before I was born, so they've been around much longer than me, this concept. I've heard a lot of recommendations related to how to let out the steam. How do you let that anger out? How do you vent it? And I've heard things like scream into a pillow. And this is stuff I've done, by the way, before I kind of heard some of the research on it. But it's stuff like scream into a pillow, punch the pillow, punch a punching bag, go get exercise, go lift weights. I've heard people do things like put a picture of someone that's angering you on a dartboard and then throw the darts at it. That's going to help you vent or something. Since about 2008, and this is where this starts becoming really relevant, there's been this whole proliferation of so-called rage rooms, or sometimes they're called smash rooms. And these have been surfacing all around the world. And they're set up in different ways, but the basic idea is generally the same stuff. You go in and you can destroy things. So you can walk in and just smash glass. They'll break objects. Sometimes they'll let you swing bats. They'll throw axes. They're always promoted as stress relief. This is a way to get your stress out. Again, this kind of venting concept. Most of them, you go in, you wear a bunch of safety glasses, and they'll get a bunch of stuff that they've gotten from junkyards or wherever. Just find some cheap stuff that you can destroy. And there's been a lot of push for rage rooms for quite a while. In fact, I've read stories about people in hospitals trying to get them installed to help staff burnout. And what's really reinforcing this whole thing is a lot of times people will walk out of the rage rooms feeling better. And so I think this is where a lot of the confusion comes in, is a lot of times you'll get this euphoria when you start working out. And when you work out, you get the additional thing of endorphins and all this other stuff that goes along with it. So there is a positive feeling that comes when you're walking out of sort of getting exercise, expressing rage, doing something that kind of vents in a sense. And so that, to me, contributes to the problem. So what is the problem? Of course, you're going to ask if there's some evidence here that we have that people are walking out of rage rooms or walking away from a venting session and they're feeling good. What's the issue? Well, there is this growing body of research that has been steadily increasing. In fact, there's been some recent developments in this too. And again, I talked about this in the Emotional Embuffination book. I have there's a chapter in it that I've called "Don't Vent and Don't Bottle," which is all about this very topic. And in that, one of my favorite, this is a little older now, but one of my favorite studies on this described in that chapter, and it basically was a spawns from a study out of Iowa State University by a guy named Brad Bushman. And what they did was they took subjects and they asked these subjects to write a little essay on their position on abortion. So we're trying to pick something that's very polarized, people feel very emotional about. Then they take these essays and they say, okay, I'm pairing you up with another student, because this was on a college campus. And so they take the paper, they hand it to another student, and they give the other student's paper to the subject. Then they say, okay, we're going to have you, we swapped your essays out. You're going to review and grade the other student's essay, and then they're going to do the same thing, and then we're going to swap them back. Now, unbeknownst to these subjects, there was no other student, but they think that somebody else is getting their essay, right? So they do their grade, they get the essay back, and then the other students' comments on the essay were very carefully crafted to represent the exact opposite position of what the subject had. So, for example, if they were pro-abortion, then they would take somebody with comments that had anti-abortion comments, or vice versa. Then, when they get these essays back and they're reading all the comments, they've carefully crafted some very toxic stuff, and just very inflammatory statements that they've filled up all over the essay. There's a handwritten comment that'll say, "This is one of the worst essays I've read," stuff like that. Just very like, "This sucks, you're terrible." So they're essentially trying to hit an emotional topic, a position on abortion, which most people have some pretty strong feelings about. Then we take the opposite position, so we're already kind of pissing them off essentially, and then we throw in some toxic comments. So in effect, we get the subject very mad, right? Then they took each of these subjects and they essentially funneled them into one of three groups. So one of the groups, they told them to hit a punching bag while imagining this other student. The next one, they said, okay, we're going to have you hit a punching bag, but we want you to just think about physical fitness. Then the third group, they said, okay, we're going to just have you sit in this room quietly for 2 minutes. Okay, so now we've broken up into three groups. Then they go back and test, and they make an assessment for anger levels. So they have a diagnostic they use to see how angry everybody is. And then they compared all the data. And so what they found was that the group that was punching the bag while thinking about this other student was the angriest. They had the highest anger level, so their anger was not dissipating. The group that was thinking about physical fitness while hitting the bag was less angry than the group that was thinking specifically about the other student, but they were still angry. The third group that was told to just sit quietly, they were by far the least angry of the group. And so what we see from that is like the person that just sat there quietly was most likely to be have gotten rid of all the anger, or gotten rid of a significant amount of the anger. Now, this research there's been a number of different studies that have been kind of growing in this sense. And in fact, in March of 2024, this year, there was a meta-study out of Ohio State University, and they were looking at a bunch of these different studies that are kind of coming up with the same conclusions, that when you vent, anger increases. And so in this study, they looked at 154 studies, and this dealt with cross-section of 10,189 students. So this is pretty recent research in essence, and where they're looking at all this stuff for a good number of people. And what they found was that what really decreases anger is not venting, but rather exercises like mindfulness, meditation, breathing exercises, yoga, counting to 10, etc. So that's consistent with what we were hearing from this previous study from Brad Bushman, where the person that was just sitting there for 2 minutes and doing nothing was the one that was most likely to dissipate anger, and the people that were actually venting and doing physical things were more likely to increase their anger, or at least perpetuate their anger. And so this meta-study also came to the conclusion that based on all of these different studies they were seeing, physiological arousal consistently made anger worse. So in other words, doing exercise at a time when you were angry amplifies anger. Now, this is, again, totally contrary to everything I have ever heard prior to looking into all these studies. And it seems very socially contrary to what we're told. This is very alien to most people. I think we've spent so much time wrapped up in this steam valve model that we think that we're going to turn into Donald Duck exploding and screaming at people if we don't let it out. Now, I think what happens is we have this model in our heads that this is the steam valve that works, this is how it works, and this is how you dissipate the anger. And when we go through there, a lot of these things that we do can create a euphoria. That is to say, like, there are things like when you do the exercise, you'll get an endorphin kick. So there is a positive feeling that comes along with that. But that doesn't necessarily get rid of the anger. This is a different thing from the anger. So you might have this euphoria, you might be running on a little bit of a high, but you're simultaneously experiencing that anger. And so venting isn't exactly getting rid of it, it's just giving you a momentary high, which is almost like taking a drug in a certain sense. Because if you're taking a drug, for example, to escape your problems, or you drink alcohol to escape your problems, you momentarily feel better. You've numbed out the pain, or you've taken yourself to some euphoric place or something like that, but you haven't eliminated the underlying issues. Like if I can't pay my rent today and I say, well, I'm just going to go get high instead, I feel good for a moment, but that doesn't change the fact that my rent hasn't been paid. I think anger is very much the same thing. I can dive into it like a drug, and I can get that high. I can get that euphoria that comes out of like smashing things, or screaming at a pillow, or punching a punching bag, or working out. But that doesn't deal with the underlying issue, the anger that is there, because it still remains and very often perpetuates, it becomes worse by way of the things that we're doing. So I would offer to you that, and this is very consistent with everything I talk about in emotional embuffination and my experiences personally, and all the research that I've read about this, is that where our focus and energy goes, we make things happen. If our energy goes into activities that are associated with the anger, we're going to perpetuate anger. So if I'm punching a punching bag, like there's anger, my focus is going into that anger, and I'm perpetuating the anger. We're keeping the anger alive, in essence. In contrast, if we're doing something that either takes the focus off of the anger or just doesn't draw attention to the anger, we stop feeding the anger. So it's almost like you can think of it more like a fire, in my opinion. And the way to stop a fire is not by throwing something onto it. The way to stop a fire is to just stop giving it fuel. If you don't throw wood on the fire, or you take away the oxygen from the fire just fizzles out, right? Same thing with anger. Anger is very much like a fire. You add fuel to it by venting, then it's going to get worse. Now, we see this basic mechanism happen in a lot of different contexts. We see it in, for example, law of attraction is a big one, where I feel like this is a big part of the reason that I buy into the law of attraction model. If you're not familiar with that, listen to a little bit of my stuff and you're going to hear about it. But law of attraction is just this idea that if you are thinking something, those thoughts are going to effectively manifest into your life. That is to say that your thoughts become reality. So the things that we dwell on sort of show up in our world some way. There's a couple different ways you can think about it. You can think of it as a sort of magical thing that all sorts of stuff happens behind the scenes in the universe and it just sort of comes to being. There's other people that kind of take the model that the thing that we're throwing our attention into sort of subconsciously finds its way, or we sort of subconsciously create situations and we take actions that are more likely to result in things that we're thinking about. There's lots of psychological effects that sort of show the same stuff, like the spotlight effect. If I start thinking about a VW bug, I'm more likely to notice all the VW bugs on the road while I'm driving down the street. So law of attraction is a big one, and that's also this very much this concept of, if I'm thinking about something, it's going to show up. Now, if you're thinking about what you're angry about from a law of attraction paradigm, you are going to make more anger. If I'm thinking anger, anger manifests, and all the products of that anger are going to manifest as well. But think about other stuff like the war on drugs. What happened with the war on drugs? It was almost like we were creating more drug usage, or at least creating more attention to it. So again, where our energy was flowing, things were coming back in the same sense. It was amplifying what was going on. Trigger warnings are another one. I may have to do a separate episode on this, but trigger warnings are one that we also commonly think of as being a problem. And here we've got a growing body of research on this as well, that's showing that despite what we all seem to think, that we're actually helping people with trigger warnings, we're generally increasing anxiety when having them versus not having them. So there have been several studies I've seen that talk about, in effect, when you have a trigger warning, people start to freak out about what they're going to see, as opposed to because usually, let me back up a step. When you have a trigger warning, the intention of that is to say, hey, I'm about to offer you some content that's going to have some material that may impact some psychological issues you've got because you've experienced some sort of trauma related to something. So, for example, let's say that a woman was raped in her past, and we're about to have a conversation where we're talking about rape. I want to say to that woman, hey, we're going to have some trigger warning. We're going to have some very sensitive topics here, specifically dealing with rape, and I want you to have the opportunity to listen to it or not. Now, the problem is that very often what actually happens is people sort of fixate on other stuff that is what truly triggers them. And it's so random that it's kind of hard to pinpoint effectively with an actual trigger warning. So, for example, somebody that was raped might not be thinking the topic of rape becomes the triggering thing so much as there was a sound of dripping water in the sink over to the left of me while I was being raped, and that sound is the thing that becomes the trigger. And because those things are so random, you can't really pinpoint generally what the trigger is going to be. And in effect, then, what happens is somebody hears the trigger warning, they start feeling anxiety over the trigger warning itself, and then they start reinforcing also the trauma that they previously had, because then their brain goes back to that, and you just spiral into this little sense of anxiety that in effect became created by the trigger warning. So my point of all this is that here again, we've got this example of a scenario where we're thinking about a thing, and we've got very good intentions. People that are creating trigger warnings are obviously trying to help. But what happens is we draw attention to it. And when we put focus into it, just like the law of attraction, when we put focus into it, when we put our energy into it, that thing perpetuates. So the trigger warnings make you triggered. The war on drugs creates more drugs and creates a war, all of this stuff. Now, with all of this said, obviously my theme here is don't vent. There is a opposite end of the spectrum, however, and this is something I also talk about in the book. I talk about some of the research related to this, and this is also part of why I think this venting concept has perpetuated for so long, is because we have actually seen some research as well that shows that if you bottle things, which is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum from venting, you are also going to create problems. And so if you're just sitting there suppressing, and you're saying, I'm really angry about this thing, I'm really angry about this thing, I'm really angry about this thing, that person over there did me wrong, and I hate them, and I'm angry, that is bottling. And the problem is that when you bottle, you see very much the same effect as venting. People will ultimately explode if they're just sitting there bottling. So if you are silently stewing, and bad things can happen in that direction too, because if we go back to what we were talking about a second ago, where your energy and focus goes, things are going to manifest. Well, if I am outwardly venting and I'm saying I'm angry at this person, I'm punching this bag while I'm thinking about them, then I'm going to manifest that, right? But if I'm not saying anything and I'm keeping it all inside, but I'm still thinking the same stuff, I'm thinking I hate that person, I'm not going to say anything, but they piss me off so much, then I'm doing the exact same thing. It's just outwardly manifesting in a slightly different way. So we have to be very careful about not picking either end of the spectrum. You don't want to vent, but you also don't want to bottle. And I think the bottling thing has reinforced this idea that we should vent. But in effect, if you look at it from this energy perspective, it's the exact same thing. This all kind of begs the question, okay, if you embrace the idea that we should not be venting, you embrace the idea that we should not be bottling, like what the heck do we do? Because you're experiencing the feelings. I mean, you're going to feel anger. You're going to feel that stuff from time to time. There are a lot of really great options. We've kind of already touched on them a little bit here, but one of my favorites is mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation involves just sort of sitting there doing a meditation where you're bringing your thoughts back to yourself, to your body, to your center, something, a candle flame sometimes. There's various things you can kind of bring your attention to, but it just, every time you find your brain shifting off, because a lot of times what will happen is you start meditating and you think, okay, I'm not going to think anything. I'm not going to think anything. What am I going to eat for dinner tonight? I've got that task I need to finish. So when you feel your brain going off to these other things, you go, nope, right back to center. And so you just keep this practice of bringing your mind back. Well, that intrinsically is taking your focus off of this other stuff that you're mad about or that you're bottling up or whatever. So mindfulness meditation is a great exercise in my mind. There's other things that kind of have similar effects. Yoga, for example. I do like yoga. I've been doing some yoga while I'm recording this. I've been in the practice of going regularly to a yoga class. And I think part of why it's so useful is, number one, it's putting your attention into something, but I hear the very same concepts that we're talking about in mindfulness meditation pop up all the time. Like, for example, the very last yoga class I went to, we were doing a particular pose. It was a little difficult to maintain balance on. And I was stumbling around. I would try to stand up in this pose, and then I would stumble and fall out of it. And then we would kind of shift on to the next movement or the next phase of what we were doing. And the instructor said, okay, if you find your brain still back in this last pose that we were doing, bring it back to where we are now. That's the past. Don't even think about that anymore. Very much the same thing as what we're talking about in mindfulness meditation. You're saying, okay, just bring your brain back here. Stop dwelling on this other stuff. So we're stopping the energy and the focus and going out to where we're angry, and we're just bringing it back to now, what you're doing this moment. And I think that's really, really important in eliminating the anger. So in essence, whatever you can do to kind of strip your energy away from the anger, which means not bottling, not venting, because those are essentially opposite ends of the same spectrum. But whatever you can do to take that off, then do that. Mindfulness meditation is great. Yoga is great. There are a lot of exercises you can do from cognitive behavioral therapy, stuff like that. I mean, there's whatever you can do to just take your attention off. Just don't vent and don't bottle. Now, I think a great example of this, and I would almost be remiss in not mentioning this briefly, is the events that we saw very recently in 2020 during the pandemic. Now, I think one of the most common things I saw was people venting. People were constantly, especially online, we were going online and just feeling our own anger. We would read about someone that had the opposite political position from us, and we would get very angry, and then we would go online and start talking about it more. And during the pandemic, we had just I don't have the data in front of me, but I had posted it before in other places. We had massively spiking in numbers of depression and anxiety, and there was a lot of negative feelings that were going around. And I would offer to you that a big part of that is because we spent so much time talking about how upset we were and how angry we were at the other side for whatever political position we were talking about. And there were a lot of issues that popped up there. And to me, this was very much venting in action. And I felt like I was sitting there saying, hey, everybody, stop venting, stop like dwelling in the news, stop putting your attention there. And that's another one. I talk very often about not watching the news. That's another running theme that I have. And I think this goes to the exact same thing, because when you're watching the news, you're basically dumping all your attention into the news. You're dumping all your attention into the bad stuff. You're thinking about all the political pundits that are saying whatever and how much they make you angry, and now you're just dwelling in the anger. Or you're thinking about all the terrible things that are happening out there, all the people that just got murdered in my city, or whatever it is, the children that have been kidnapped, or the drug problems that are out there, or whatever the issue is. If your energy is going to that, you're just going to start feeling all this anger and upset in you. And very often, if you follow the law of attraction model, you're going to start finding some of those same things circling into your universe anyway. So again, don't watch the news. It's very much the same thing as where this energy is going thing. We want to keep the energy in a positive place. Don't dump it into venting. Don't dump it into bottling. Don't start watching the news and dwelling all on the negative stuff. And if you can get into this practice and you can do this effectively, I promise you're going to feel better. You're not going to go down, you're not going to spiral things out of control. You're not going to experience these increasing levels of anger. This is also one more example, and then I'll leave it after this. I've done family law for a very long time. Family law is divorces and custody fights. I've worked as an attorney in that context. And there's actually a chapter on this in the book as well. There's this experience that I see people go through where they kind of seem reasonable and rational at the beginning of a case, and as the case sort of rolls on over time, like you get in like a year and a half, people have just been kind of dwelling on it constantly, and they're like so upset about what their ex is doing or what they're saying to their kids, or how unreasonable the positions are. And I've seen people that go home and just like spew information to their new love interest or whatever, their buddies at the bar, and they lose their minds and stop functioning even remotely rationally when we get like a year and a half into it. So people just go crazy in the family law context. Same thing we saw during the pandemic. I see it all over the place where people just go nuts. And that's because we're dumping all of our attention into these things that are making us angry, and all we can see is injustice, and you start to not think rationally. You start to do things that are unjust, and then more unjust stuff happens to you because of it. Judge gets angry because you did some dumb thing because you exploded for no reason, et cetera, et cetera. So moral of the story, don't vent, don't bottle, and I promise you're going to be feeling a lot better, over time, and you're going to definitely minimize your problems and the amount of anger you're feeling. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. That'll bring us to a wrap for today's show. I hope, once again, that you found this useful. I hope that this is something you can incorporate into your life. I hope you find some little nugget here that's going to improve your emotional states. Remember, emotional embuffination is a lot like working out. You don't go to the gym once and say, I am buff forever. You keep going on a regular basis. You make it part of your routine. You go a few times a week, if not more. And over time, that starts to improve things. Same thing is true with emotional embuffination. You don't just read a book once and you say, I'm emotionally buff forever. You keep studying it. You keep working on it every day. And that's what we're trying to do here with emotional embuffination. Don't forget to go to embuff.com and sign up for the newsletter there. Please, again, like and subscribe wherever you've seen this or listened to this podcast. Remember, keep working on this stuff. At the end of the day, my objective is to make you emotionally strong enough to go from saying things like, the struggle is real, to saying, what struggle? Thank you all for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this. Have a great week, and I will see you on the next show.